Hey guys, tonight we are tiptoeing back to the 19th century into the hushed, often chilly bedrooms of the Victorian era. Imagine, if you will, the gas lamps casting long, flickering shadows on heavy velvet curtains, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and, perhaps, a hint of stale potpourri. You're probably tucked into a rather grand, four-poster bed, piled high with more blankets than strictly necessary, because central heating? That's a luxury for the distant, unimaginable future. And despite the seeming quiet, a good night's sleep is proving rather elusive. For many Victorians, just like for some of us today, drifting off into peaceful slumber wasn't always a straightforward affair. They fretted, they tossed, they turned, and they desperately sought remedies for those long, wakeful hours. Honestly, given their often drafty houses, questionable nighttime snacks, and a distinct lack of binge-watchable streaming services to numb the brain, it's a wonder any of them got any sleep at all. You probably wouldn't last a week with their sleep hygiene or lack thereof. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The late Victorian period, say from the 1870s onwards, saw an increasing awareness, or perhaps an increasing public discussion about sleeplessness. It wasn't just the poor who struggled, huddled in overcrowded tenements, but also the burgeoning middle and upper classes, those with the leisure to actually worry about not sleeping. Their bedrooms, while perhaps grander, were often just as problematic. Think about it. Heavy, dust-trapping draperies were de rigueur, essential for keeping out the drafts from ill-fitting windows and the pervasive gloom of the industrial city, but also perfect for harboring all sorts of unseen microscopic beasties. Ventilation was a tricky business. Opening a window might let in the fresh city air, which often meant a delightful cocktail of soot, factory fumes, and the aroma of horse-drawn traffic. Not exactly conducive to a lungful of calming night air. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were genuinely more afflicted by insomnia or if it was simply a period where such ailments became more openly discussed and medicalized, a topic worthy of polite conversation and, crucially, commercial enterprise. The very notion of a dedicated bedroom as a private sanctuary was also evolving. For many, it was still a multifunctional space. And the light, or rather the lack of it. Gaslight, while an improvement on candles and oil lamps, flickered, hissed, and consumed oxygen. It wasn't the sort of gentle, warm glow we might associate with a cozy evening. And when it was extinguished, the darkness was profound, often only broken by the moon, if you were lucky enough to have a clear night and a window not entirely caked in grime. This deep darkness, coupled with the silence of a pre-electric world, a silence punctuated by the clatter of a distant carriage, the cry of a night watchman, or perhaps the unsettling scurry of unseen inhabitants within the walls, could be either a comfort or a source of profound unease. For those already prone to anxiety, the Victorian night could be a long, lonely vigil. And it's in this atmosphere of hushed disquiet and flickering shadows that the quest for reliable sleep cures truly began to flourish. A quest that would lead down some rather interesting, and occasionally alarming, pathways. We're talking about a time before melatonin gummies and white noise machines. A time when a good night's sleep was often pursued with a mixture of folk wisdom, emerging science, and a healthy dose of sheer desperation. The commonality of these sleep woes is evident in the sheer volume of advice columns in periodicals, the concerned letters to doctors, and, as we'll see, the booming market for anything that promised a few hours of oblivion. Now, when you're lying there in your hypothetical Victorian bed, the silence pressing in, the shadows dancing like mischievous sprites, and sleep remains stubbornly out of reach, what's the first thing a well-meaning, if slightly desperate, Victorian might reach for? Well, chances are it would be something containing opium. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was the Victorian equivalent of an over-the-counter cure-all, and it was astonishingly prevalent. You could pop down to your local chemist, or even some grocers, and pick up a bottle with remarkable ease. No prescription needed, thank you very much. It was marketed for everything from coughs and colds to teething babies, and, crucially for our purposes, as a sovereign remedy for sleeplessness and nervous affections. Imagine the appeal. A few drops of this dark, bitter liquid, and the anxieties of the day, the gnawing worries, the physical discomforts, would simply recede. It promised a swift, if rather potent, descent into a state of drowsy indifference, which was often mistaken for genuine, restful sleep. The list of famous Victorians who regularly used laudanum is long and rather distinguished, including literary figures like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Wilkie Collins, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose struggles with opium addiction are well documented. It wasn't seen, at least initially, with the same stigma that opioids carry today. It was simply medicine, a common household staple. Many a Victorian matriarch kept a bottle handy for any number of ailments within the family, doling it out with a confidence that now seems rather terrifying. One mainstream historical fact is that the widespread, unregulated availability of opium and its derivatives was a significant public health issue throughout the 19th century, leading to countless accidental overdoses and insidious addictions before its dangers were fully recognized and controlled. The ease with which one could slip from therapeutic use to dependency was a path trodden by many, often in complete ignorance of the drug's powerful addictive properties. You might start taking it for a persistent cough or a bout of insomnia, only to find that you couldn't quite function without your daily dose. A quirky, or perhaps rather grim, tidbit is the existence of soothing syrups for infants, many of which contained opiates. Products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup were advertised to calm fretful babies and help them sleep, essentially by sedating them. While the mothers might have enjoyed a quiet house, the long-term effects on the children were often devastating. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates in the Victorian era were significantly exacerbated by the casual administration of these opiate-laced concoctions, though it's hard to imagine they helped. It's a sobering thought, the idea of quieting a nursery with a substance we now know to be incredibly dangerous. The advertising for laudanum and similar products was often couched in gentle, reassuring terms, promising calm, repose, and relief from pain and anxiety. It's easy to see how, in an era with limited medical alternatives and a profound belief in the power of a good bottle of physic, laudanum became the go-to lullaby for a society struggling to switch off. The problem, of course, was that the sleep it induced wasn't truly restorative, and the price for that temporary oblivion could be extraordinarily high, a creeping dependency that could unravel lives as surely as any more sensational Victorian melodrama. You'd think someone might have noticed that sleeping like a baby shouldn't involve quite so many narcotics, but hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths, or perhaps, in this case, laudanum-tinted. As the 19th century wore on, and perhaps as the more alarming consequences of widespread laudanum use, like that little problem of addiction we just talked about, began to subtly filter into public and medical consciousness, the search for alternative sleep aids intensified. While opium never entirely lost its grip, new chemical contenders started to appear on the scene, promising the same blissful oblivion but, supposedly, with fewer of the associated drawbacks. Two such substances that gained considerable traction were bromides, particularly potassium bromide, and chloral hydrate. These weren't your grandmother's herbal remedies. These were products of the burgeoning chemical industry, offered with a reassuring veneer of scientific progress. If laudanum was the slightly disreputable old friend you secretly relied on, these were the new, sophisticated acquaintances promising a more refined path to slumber. Potassium bromide began to be used as a sedative and anticonvulsant in the mid-1800s. It was thought to calm the nervous system, making it a popular prescription for everything from epilepsy to, you guessed it, insomnia and general nervousness. You might find your Victorian physician sagely nodding and prescribing a course of bromides if you complained of an inability to quiet your mind at night. The theory was that it depressed the central nervous system, leading to a state of calm and, ideally, sleep. And for some, it probably did offer a degree of sedation. However, one mainstream historical fact is that long-term use of bromides could lead to a rather unpleasant condition known as bromism. Symptoms included skin rashes, Bromide acne was a known telltale sign: memory loss, drowsiness, tremors, and even psychosis. So, while you might have eventually fallen asleep, you could also have woken up with a face full of spots and a distinct inability to remember your own name. A fair trade? The Victorians, in their relentless pursuit of a good night's rest, seemed to think so, at least for a while. Chloral hydrate, synthesized in 1832 but popularized as a sedative and hypnotic later in the century, was another star player. It gained a reputation as a faster-acting and perhaps cleaner alternative to opiates for inducing sleep. It was famously or infamously implicated in some rather high-profile cases and became known colloquially as knockout drops, hinting at its potent capabilities. You'd take a dose and sleep would, in many cases, follow relatively swiftly. One quirky tidbit surrounding chloral hydrate is its rather narrow therapeutic window. The difference between a dose that would send you to sleep and a dose that could send you to the morgue was alarmingly small. Accidental overdoses were not uncommon, and it also had a nasty habit of being addictive. Furthermore, it was known to interact dangerously with alcohol, a combination sometimes referred to as a Mickey Finn in later slang, used to render someone unconscious. So that quiet nightcap you might have enjoyed could become significantly less quiet if chloral hydrate was also on your bedside table. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of these newer chemical sedatives truly outweighed their significant risks, especially given the often haphazard way they were prescribed and consumed. It was an era of therapeutic experimentation, and patients were, willingly or unwillingly, often the test subjects. The allure of a quick fix, a chemical shortcut to bypass the anxieties of the Victorian night, was incredibly strong. You might think that after the laudanum experience, people would be warier of miracle sleep drugs, but hope, as they say, springs eternal, especially when you haven't slept properly in a week and your doctor, in his very smart suit, assures you this new potion is perfectly safe. Perfectly, beyond the chemist's bottle, with its tempting array of opiates and bromides. Some Victorians suffering from persistent sleeplessness, particularly those of a certain social standing and with a diagnosis of nerves or neurasthenia, might find themselves prescribed a rather more elaborate and, frankly, bizarre regimen, the rest cure. Pioneered by the American neurologist Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, this treatment became quite fashionable in the latter decades of the 19th century, especially for women deemed to be suffering from nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or, of course, an intractable inability to sleep. If you were a well-to-do Victorian lady finding the pressures of, well, whatever pressures a well-to-do Victorian lady faced, a bit too much, you might be packed off for a few weeks or even months of the rest cure. It sounds rather pleasant, doesn't it? Rest. Who wouldn't want a bit more of that? But the Victorian interpretation of rest was, shall we say, a little more intense. The core components of Dr. Weir Mitchell's rest cure were absolute bed rest, isolation, a high-fat, high-calorie diet, often involving being force-fed if necessary, and massage, sometimes accompanied by electrical stimulation. Yes, you read that right. You'd be confined to your bed, often in a darkened room, forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or engaging in almost any form of mental or physical activity. The idea was to completely remove all stimuli and allow the nervous system to repair itself. One mainstream historical fact is that the rest cure, while perhaps offering some respite from overwhelming social or domestic pressures for certain individuals, was also criticized, even at the time, for its infantilizing and oppressive nature, particularly towards women. Famous literary figures like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who underwent the treatment, wrote scathingly about its detrimental effects on her mental health, famously channeling her experience into the chilling short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. She was, in essence, told to abandon her intellectual pursuits, which, for a writer, is like telling a fish to avoid water. Not exactly a recipe for mental well-being. The diet was another peculiar aspect. Patients were often fed vast quantities of milk, sometimes up to 2 quarts a day, along with meat, bread, and butter, with the aim of building up their physical strength, which was believed to be intrinsically linked to nervous energy. Imagine being spoon-fed like an infant, lying in bed day after day, with nothing to do but stare at the ceiling and contemplate the fascinating patterns in the wallpaper, which, as Gilman's story suggests, could lead to its own unique brand of madness. A quirky tidbit is that Dr. Weir Mitchell was, by all accounts, a rather imposing and authoritative figure, and the success of his cure often depended on the patient's complete submission to his will. Disobedience or questioning the regimen was seen as a symptom of the illness itself. Historians still argue whether the rest cure was a genuinely therapeutic intervention based on the, albeit limited, neurological understanding of the time, or if it was more a reflection of patriarchal societal norms and a desire to control hysterical or nonconformist women. It certainly ensured they weren't out causing any trouble like, thinking or having opinions. You might be prescribed this if your local GP, after listening to your tales of sleepless nights and general malaise, decided your nerves were simply too frayed for anything less than total systemic shutdown. The sheer boredom alone might have eventually induced sleep, one imagines, if only as an escape. Or perhaps the constant prodding from the massage therapist, a sort of human tenderizer, would do the trick. If being confined to bed and force-fed milk wasn't quite your cup of tea. And frankly, whose cup of tea would that be? Perhaps your Victorian physician, noting your persistent wakefulness and that slightly glazed look in your eyes, might suggest a different approach: hydrotherapy. The Victorians had an absolute passion for water cures, or hydropathy, as it was often known. This wasn't just about a quick splash in the morning. This was a comprehensive system of treatments involving water in all its forms, temperatures, and applications, all aimed at restoring health and, naturally, promoting that ever-elusive sleep. From the grand spa towns like Bath, Harrogate, or Buxton in England, or similar establishments across Europe and America, to more modest local hydrotherapy centers, the belief in water's healing power was pervasive. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief as people imagined their anxieties dissolving in a warm bath, or their sluggish systems being invigorated by a bracing cold douche. The range of hydrotherapeutic treatments available was quite staggering. There were, of course, the full immersion baths, which could be hot, cold, or tepid, sometimes infused with minerals or herbs. Then you had sitz baths, hip baths, and foot baths. There were various forms of douches, essentially targeted jets of water, which could be directed at specific parts of the body with varying degrees of force and temperature. Imagine a Victorian version of a power wash, but for your liver. One mainstream historical fact is that hydropathic establishments were often run with a strict, almost quasi-medical regimen, involving not just water treatments but also controlled diets, exercise, often gentle walks in the fresh air, and a structured daily routine. The idea was to create a holistic healing environment, far removed from the stresses and pollutions of city life. Patients might spend weeks or even months at these spas, taking the waters and submitting to a rigorous schedule of douching, soaking, and wrapping. A quirky tidbit about Victorian hydrotherapy is the wet sheet pack. This involved being wrapped tightly in cold, wet linen sheets, then covered with a mountain of blankets to induce sweating. You'd lie there, trussed up like a soggy mummy, for an hour or more. The theory was that this would draw out toxins and calm the nerves. It sounds more like a recipe for a nasty chill, but it was a surprisingly popular treatment. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of hydrotherapy were primarily due to the physiological effects of the water itself, the placebo effect of undergoing such elaborate rituals, or simply the benefits of escaping a stressful home environment and adhering to a healthier lifestyle while at the spa. It's likely a combination of all three. You might find yourself prescribed a course of hydrotherapy if your doctor felt your system was sluggish or your humors imbalanced. Very Victorian concepts. The promise of a natural cure using the elemental power of water was incredibly appealing compared to, say, the known side effects of those chemical concoctions like the bromides we shuddered at earlier. And who knows, perhaps after being systematically hosed down, wrapped like a damp parcel, and made to drink slightly metallic-tasting spa water all day, sleep would come simply from sheer exhaustion. Or maybe the rhythmic sloshing sounds just had a surprisingly soporific effect. One can only hope. Now, if the thought of being alternately boiled, frozen, and power washed in the name of hydrotherapy didn't quite appeal, or if your personal physician was more inclined towards less damp methods, considerable attention would undoubtedly be paid to your diet. The Victorians, much like us, understood that what you consumed could significantly impact your well-being, including your ability to achieve restful sleep. Advice on diet for dreamland, as we might call it, abounded in household manuals, medical journals, and those ever-present advice columns. The general consensus was that a heavy supper, eaten late in the evening, was a surefire recipe for a night of tossing, turning, and quite possibly vivid, indigestion-fueled nightmares. You can just picture the scene. A groaning Victorian dinner table, laden with multiple courses of roasted meats, rich gravies, suet puddings, and perhaps a hefty slab of Stilton to finish, all washed down with ale or port. Delicious, perhaps, but not exactly conducive to a light, airy feeling as you lay your head on the pillow a few hours later. The typical Victorian advice, therefore, often centered on consuming a light, easily digestible evening meal. Think perhaps a small bowl of gruel, a thrilling prospect, I know, a little toast, or perhaps some boiled fish. Excitement was definitely not on the menu if you were aiming for a good night's sleep. One mainstream historical fact is that many Victorian health reformers and dietary advisors emphasized the importance of regularity in mealtimes and thorough mastication, chewing your food properly, believing that this aided digestion and prevented the kind of gastric distress that could interfere with sleep. The sound advice even today, though perhaps delivered with a little less Victorian sternness. They were also quite concerned with the stimulating effects of certain foods and drinks. Tea and coffee, while increasingly popular, were often cautioned against in the evenings, much like we're told today. Alcohol was a more complex issue. While a nightcap like a small glass of warm ale or wine was sometimes seen as a gentle sedative, excessive consumption was rightly identified as disruptive to sleep patterns, leading to that unpleasant wakefulness in the small hours of the morning. Beyond simple avoidance of heavy or stimulating foods, there were also specific items believed to possess soporific or sleep-inducing qualities. A quirky tidbit is the Victorian fondness for lettuce, particularly lettuce water or lettuce soup, as a mild sedative. The milky sap of certain lettuce varieties, like wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, does contain compounds with slight opiate-like effects known as lacticarium or lettuce opium. While the effects from your average garden lettuce would be minimal, the belief was there. You might find yourself sipping a lukewarm cup of lettuce tea, hoping it would usher you into the land of Nod. Historians still argue whether many of these soporific foods had any genuine pharmacological effect, or if their reputation was built more on anecdotal evidence, tradition, and the power of suggestion. If you believed warm milk or a bowl of arrowroot pudding would help you sleep, perhaps it did, simply by creating a comforting, relaxing ritual. You can imagine a Victorian matron, armed with Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, carefully planning the evening meal to avoid anything too exciting or rich for the delicate sleeper in the family. No spicy curries making their way from the colonies onto that particular dinner plate if a restful night was the goal. Perhaps a nice, bland bread pudding instead. Oh, the culinary thrills of the Victorian quest for sleep. It's enough to make you crave a laudanum chaser, just for a bit of flavor. Beyond what you put into your Victorian body, considerable thought was also given to the environment around your body as you attempted to woo the Sandman. Optimizing the bedroom for sleep was a topic of great interest, though their understanding of what constituted optimal sometimes differed amusingly from our own. We've already touched on the dim lighting and the potential for drafty windows, but Victorian advice delved deeper into the specifics of creating a tranquil, sleep-conducive atmosphere, or at least what they perceived as such. Remember those heavy draperies we mentioned? While good for blocking light and drafts, they also, as we noted, trap dust and limited air circulation, which brings us to a major Victorian preoccupation: ventilation. Fresh air was considered paramount for health, a vital force against the miasmas and ill humors thought to cause disease. However, the Victorian approach to ventilating a bedroom, especially at night, was a bit of a balancing act. Too little air, and the room became close and stuffy, filled with your own noxious exhalations. Their words, not mine mostly. Too much air, especially cold night air, was thought to be dangerous, capable of causing chills, agues, and all sorts of pulmonary complaints. One mainstream historical fact is that many Victorian houses, even grand ones, were designed with complex, if sometimes inefficient, systems of flues, vents, and windows intended to promote air circulation without creating direct, bone-chilling drafts on the sleeper. The ideal was a gentle, imperceptible current of fresh air passing through the room. Achieving this in a smog-filled city, with fireplaces that either belched smoke or sucked all the warm air up the chimney, was another matter entirely. You might find yourself meticulously adjusting window sashes, perhaps employing a special screen to deflect direct breezes, all in an effort to get the air quality just right. Darkness, too, was considered important as it is today. Those heavy curtains certainly helped, and some Victorians went to great lengths to ensure absolute darkness, believing that even the faintest glimmer of light could disturb a sensitive sleeper. A quirky tidbit is the use of elaborate bed hangings not just for warmth or privacy, but also to create a darker, more enclosed sleeping space within the larger room, a sort of fabric cocoon. Think of those grand four-poster beds, entirely draped in thick material. While cozy, one can only imagine the dust mite population thriving in such an environment. Quiet, naturally, was also prized. In an era before double glazing, the sounds of the city, the clatter of iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors even in the early or late hours, the striking of church clocks, were much more intrusive. Those living in bustling urban centers might have longed for the quiet of the countryside, while rural dwellers had their own set of nighttime noises to contend with, from hooting owls to the lowing of distant cattle. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were more or less sensitive to noise than modern individuals, or if the type of noise pollution has simply changed. It's hard to say if the rumble of a distant omnibus is more or less sleep-disturbing than the hum of a neighbor's air conditioning unit. The quest for a perfectly silent, perfectly dark, perfectly ventilated Victorian bedroom was an ongoing, often frustrating, endeavor. You might even resort to stuffing cotton wool in your ears, a practice that some sleep seekers still employ today, proving some struggles are timeless, even if the source of the noise has evolved from horses to horsepower. While the men in white coats, or rather sober Victorian frock coats, were busy prescribing their chemical concoctions and elaborate rest cures, a quieter, more traditional approach to sleeplessness persisted, rooted in centuries of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and poultices. For many Victorians, particularly those outside the immediate reach of fashionable physicians or those with a healthy skepticism towards newfangled drugs, the garden and the hedgerow still held the keys to a peaceful night. These weren't the slickly packaged herbal supplements you see today, but rather infusions made from dried leaves and flowers, or comforting topical applications prepared in the home kitchen. You can almost smell the gentle aroma of chamomile tea steeping on a Victorian stove, a hopeful offering to the fickle gods of slumber. The use of herbal infusions or tisanes for calming the nerves and promoting sleep was widespread. Chamomile tea, just as it is today, was a popular choice, valued for its mild sedative and soothing properties. Hops, the same plant that gives beer its bitter flavor, were also highly regarded. Pillows stuffed with dried hops were a common folk remedy for insomnia. The idea was that the subtle aroma released by the warmth of the sleeper's head would induce drowsiness. One mainstream historical fact is that the medicinal use of plants like valerian root, passion flower, and lavender for their calming and sedative effects has a long history, and scientific research has since identified active compounds in some of these botanicals that do indeed interact with brain chemistry to promote relaxation. So, while Victorian understanding might have been based on tradition and observation rather than double-blind studies, their instincts weren't always off the mark. You might find your Victorian grandmother sagely advising a cup of warm lime flower, linden, tea before bed, or perhaps a decoction of lemon balm, believed to soothe anxiety and lift the spirits, thereby paving the way for sleep. Beyond drinkable remedies, Victorians also employed topical applications in the form of poultices or compresses, though these were perhaps more often used for aches and pains that might prevent sleep, rather than as direct soporifics. However, a warm, fragrant poultice applied to the temples or the chest could certainly have a comforting and relaxing effect. A quirky tidbit involves the use of onion poultices. While more commonly associated with coughs and chest congestion, a warm onion poultice applied to the feet was sometimes believed to draw out morbid humors and promote general well-being, which could indirectly aid sleep. One can only imagine the fragrant atmosphere of a bedroom where onion foot poultices were a regular feature. Perhaps it kept unwanted visitors away too, ensuring a quieter night. Historians still argue about the efficacy of many of these traditional remedies, distinguishing between genuine physiological effects, placebo responses, and the simple comfort derived from ritual and care. When a loved one prepared a warm herbal drink or carefully applied a soothing compress, the act of nurturing itself could be profoundly calming, regardless of the specific ingredients. It's a far cry from the impersonal transaction of buying a bottle of laudanum, isn't it? You're not just consuming a substance. You're partaking in a tradition, a gentle ritual passed down through generations, hoping that the wisdom of the ancients, or at least your great-aunt Mildred, held the secret to a few hours of blessed unconsciousness. And if nothing else, a pillow filled with hops probably smelled a darn sight better than one that hadn't been aired since Queen Victoria's coronation. Now, if sipping lettuce water or surrounding yourself with the aroma of onions and hops didn't quite do the trick, the ever-inventive Victorians, with their burgeoning fascination for all things mechanical and scientific, also turned their minds to more engineered solutions for sleeplessness. While we might not find elaborate steam-powered sheep-counting machines, though one can dream, the 19th century did see the emergence of various peculiar inventions and contraptions designed to physically encourage, monitor, or otherwise influence the state of slumber. This was an era, after all, that gave us the telegraph, the telephone, and the incandescent light bulb. Surely the problem of a bad night's sleep could also yield to a bit of clever engineering. You can almost picture a slightly mad inventor in his workshop, surrounded by gears and springs, muttering about the precise torque required to induce perfect repose. One area of interest was the bed itself. Beyond the traditional four-posters and simple bedsteads, inventors experimented with therapeutic or invalid beds that offered various adjustments and features, some of which were ostensibly aimed at improving sleep for those with ailments. One mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era saw significant advancements in hospital bed design, with features like adjustable backrests and mechanisms for raising and lowering sections of the mattress, driven by the needs of caring for the sick and injured, particularly during wartime, think Florence Nightingale. While not solely for insomnia, a more comfortable and supportive bed was naturally considered beneficial for sleep. You might find advertisements for beds with special spring systems or hygienic mattresses made from new materials, all promising a superior night's rest. No more lumpy featherbeds harboring who knows what. Progress demanded scientifically designed sleeping surfaces. A quirky tidbit from this era, though perhaps leaning more towards monitoring than inducing sleep, is the concept of early sleep trackers or devices to measure restlessness. While not as sophisticated as our modern smartwatches, there were experimental attempts to record movement during sleep, often involving complex arrangements of levers and styluses connected to the bed, which would scratch a record onto a smoked drum or paper. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep knowing you were tethered to a machine that was diligently recording every toss and turn for later scientific scrutiny. It sounds more anxiety-inducing than sleep-promoting, a sort of performance art of restlessness. Historians still argue whether these early attempts at objective sleep measurement contributed meaningfully to the understanding of sleep disorders or were more a reflection of the Victorian obsession with measurement and classification in all areas of life and science. It's part of that broader drive to quantify and understand the human body, even in its most unconscious state. And while perhaps not a direct cure, there were also contraptions designed to enforce certain sleeping postures, like devices to prevent snoring by stopping someone from sleeping on their back, perhaps a strap or a specially designed pillow that made back sleeping uncomfortable. Your long-suffering Victorian spouse might have heartily endorsed such an invention. So, while they might not have had electrically rocking beds or white noise generators, the Victorians were certainly not averse to applying a bit of mechanical ingenuity to the age-old problem of getting some shut-eye, even if some of their inventions now seem more like curious museum pieces than practical solutions. One shudders to think what a steam-powered relaxation chair might have entailed. probably involved a lot of hissing and a distinct risk of scalding. Beyond the tangible remedies of potions, poultices, and peculiar contraptions, the Victorian era also witnessed a fascination with the less material, the more mysterious forces that might influence the mind and, by extension, sleep. This was a time when the lines between science, medicine, and what we might now consider pseudoscience or even parlor entertainment were often rather blurred. Enter the intriguing and slightly spooky worlds of mesmerism and early forms of hypnosis, both of which were explored with varying degrees of seriousness and success as potential avenues to soothe the agitated mind and usher in a state of peaceful slumber. If your nerves were too frayed for laudanum and your constitution too delicate for the wet sheet pack, perhaps a session with a mesmerist, with his intense gaze and mysterious passes, was just the ticket. Mesmerism, named after its proponent Franz Anton Mesmer in the late 18th century, was based on the idea of animal magnetism, a supposed invisible natural force or fluid possessed by all living things. Mesmerists claimed they could manipulate this fluid to induce a trance-like state in their subjects, leading to therapeutic effects, including the relief of pain and the induction of sleep. One mainstream historical fact is that while mainstream medical science largely dismissed Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism, the practice of mesmerism, involving techniques like fixed gazes, hand passes, and suggestion, did produce observable phenomena, such as trance states and apparent insensitivity to pain, which piqued the interest of some physicians and researchers. It laid some of the groundwork for the later development of hypnotism. You might find yourself attending a public demonstration of mesmerism, watching as the practitioner seemingly puts volunteers into a deep slumber with a few dramatic gestures. Or perhaps you'd seek out a private consultation, hoping to have your own vital fluids rebalanced. The transition from mesmerism to what became known as hypnotism, a term coined by James Braid in the 1840s, involved a shift away from the animal magnetism theory towards a more psychological understanding, focusing on suggestion and the subject's focused attention. A quirky tidbit is that early hypnotic sessions were sometimes quite theatrical, with practitioners using swinging pocket watches or flickering lights to induce a state of focused relaxation, much like the popular caricatures we see today. While some medical men explored hypnosis for surgical anesthesia or to treat hysteria, its application for insomnia was a natural extension. The idea was to guide the subject into a deeply relaxed state, bypassing the conscious anxieties that kept them awake, and then perhaps offer post-hypnotic suggestions for continued restful sleep. Historians still argue about the true nature of the mesmeric or hypnotic trance and the extent to which its effects were due to genuine altered states of consciousness versus suggestibility, placebo, or even outright charlatanism in some cases. The field was certainly populated by both serious investigators and flamboyant showmen. You can imagine the scene. A dimly lit Victorian parlor, the mesmerist making intense eye contact, his voice a low, soothing drone, promising you release from your nightly torment. Whether it was animal magnetism, suggestion, or just the sheer novelty and focused attention, for some it might have provided a welcome, if unconventional, pathway to the land of Nod. And at least it didn't involve ingesting anything questionable or being wrapped up like a human spring roll. Unless, of course, the mesmerist suggested you were a spring roll. Then all bets were off. While the Victorians were clearly open to a wide array of physical and even quasi-mystical interventions for their sleep woes, they also placed considerable emphasis on the moral and mental dimensions of achieving a good night's rest. This was, after all, an era deeply concerned with self-discipline, moral rectitude, and the power of the will. It stood to reason, therefore, that one's state of mind and adherence to certain principles could significantly impact the ability to sleep soundly. If your conscience was clear and your thoughts properly managed, sleep, it was believed, should naturally follow. This wasn't about a quick fix from a bottle or a mechanical aid. This was about cultivating an inner landscape conducive to peace and tranquility, a sort of mental housekeeping before retiring for the night. A significant aspect of this approach was the idea of mental discipline. Victorians were often advised to actively control their thoughts, particularly in the evening. Engaging in exciting or overly stimulating mental activities before bed was strongly discouraged. This might include reading sensational novels, those thrilling penny dreadfuls, engaging in heated debates, or dwelling on business worries or unresolved anxieties. One mainstream historical fact is that Victorian conduct manuals and health guides frequently stressed the importance of a calm, reflective period before sleep, perhaps involving light, edifying reading, think uplifting poetry or a particularly soothing sermon, quiet contemplation, or gentle conversation. The aim was to consciously steer the mind away from agitating topics and towards a state of placid acceptance. You might be encouraged to review your day in a detached manner, make peace with any transgressions, and essentially empty your mind of the day's clutter, much like tidying your desk before leaving the office. A tidy mind, a tidy sleep. Prayer, for many Victorians, was an integral part of this pre-sleep ritual. Evening prayers were not just a religious observance, but also a means of seeking solace, expressing gratitude, and entrusting one's worries to a higher power, thereby unburdening the mind. A quirky tidbit is the existence of specific published prayers or devotional readings intended for use at bedtime, sometimes with sections dedicated to petitioning for restful sleep or protection through the night. These could offer a structured way to channel anxieties and find a sense of peace. Beyond formal prayer, the cultivation of a Christian character, emphasizing virtues like patience, forgiveness, and temperance, was also seen as conducive to inner peace and therefore good sleep. If you were seething with resentment or consumed by worldly ambitions, how could you possibly expect your nervous system to settle down? Historians still argue whether the emphasis on moral and mental control as a sleep aid was truly effective in a broad sense, or if it inadvertently placed an additional burden of guilt on those who still couldn't sleep, implying a personal failing of character or willpower. If only you were more virtuous/disciplined/prayerful. The unspoken message might have been, you would sleep like a baby. That's a rather heavy cross to bear when you're already exhausted. Still, the underlying principle of creating a calm mental space before sleep is one that resonates even in modern sleep hygiene advice, albeit usually stripped of the more overtly moralistic Victorian overtones. So, you might find yourself in your hypothetical Victorian nightgown, consciously trying to banish thoughts of that unpaid bill or that scandalous piece of gossip you heard, and instead focusing on, well, whatever a Victorian considered to be exceptionally unexciting. The thrilling life cycle of the common earthworm, perhaps, for those Victorians whose sleeplessness proved particularly stubborn, resisting the allure of laudanum, the rigors of hydrotherapy, and even the most disciplined mental calisthenics. Sometimes a more drastic change of scenery was prescribed, traveling for slumber. The idea that a change in climate, air quality, or general environment could restore health and promote sleep was a popular one. If your London townhouse, with its smog and endless clatter, was deemed the source of your wakeful nights, perhaps a sojourn to the seaside, with its bracing salty air, or a retreat to the tranquil countryside, would be just the thing to reset your internal clock. You can almost see the weary city dweller, pale and drawn, packing their trunk with a renewed sense of hope, imagining a future filled with long, uninterrupted nights under a starry country sky. The seaside was a particularly favored destination. The purported health benefits of sea air, and even sea bathing, another form of hydrotherapy, really were widely extolled. One mainstream historical fact is that many British coastal towns, such as Brighton, Scarborough, and Torquay, experienced significant growth and development during the Victorian era as they became popular health resorts. Physicians would often recommend a stay by the sea for a variety of ailments, including nervous disorders and insomnia. The combination of fresh, supposedly ozone-rich air, the rhythmic sound of the waves, nature's own white noise machine, if you will, and the opportunity for gentle outdoor exercise like strolling along the promenade, was thought to be deeply restorative. You might find yourself bundled up against the wind, taking your prescribed daily walk along the cliff tops, dutifully inhaling the invigorating air and hoping it would work its magic on your overwrought nerves. A quirky tidbit relating to travel for health is the concept of the invalid carriage, or specifically adapted railway cars for those too frail to travel comfortably by ordinary means. While not solely for insomniacs, it highlights the lengths to which Victorians would go to seek out curative environments. Imagine being transported, perhaps on a specially sprung couch, to a distant spa town or a quiet rural retreat. the journey itself being part of the therapeutic process. For the truly wealthy, extended trips to warmer, sunnier climes like the French Riviera or Italy were also considered beneficial, especially during the damp, gloomy British winters. Historians still argue how much of the benefit derived from such health tourism was due to actual climatic or environmental factors versus the simple effect of a prolonged holiday, escaping work, social obligations, and the stresses of daily life. Being removed from the source of one's anxieties, surrounded by new and pleasant scenery, and having one's days structured around gentle recreation and rest would likely improve anyone's sleep, regardless of the specific mineral content of the local water or the precise barometric pressure. You might be advised by your doctor to take the air at Malvern, famous for its pure spring water, and yet another hydrotherapy hotspot. Remember those? Or perhaps a quiet village in the Lake District, far from the madding crowd and, more importantly, far from whatever was keeping you up at night back home. The prescription was essentially a geographical cure, hoping that a new latitude and longitude would somehow realign your ability to drift off. And who wouldn't feel a bit more relaxed after a few weeks of being waited on in a pleasant hotel, with nothing more taxing to do than admire the view and decide whether to have the fish or the chicken for dinner? Sleep might just follow as a happy side effect of a very nice vacation. While much of our focus has been on adult Victorians wrestling with sleeplessness, it's worth briefly peeking into the nursery to see how the younger members of the household were encouraged, or sometimes cajoled, into the land of Nod. Getting children to sleep through the night has been a parental holy grail for centuries, and the Victorians were no different. Their methods, however, ranged from the gently persuasive to the, by modern standards, rather alarming, often reflecting the broader societal attitudes towards child-rearing and medicine we've encountered. You can picture a dimly lit Victorian nursery, a tired mother or nursemaid desperately trying to settle a fretful infant, perhaps resorting to a repertoire of lullabies, rocking, and other more potent soothers. Rocking was, of course, a time-honored method. Elaborate rocking cradles, some even with rudimentary mechanical actions, were common. The gentle, rhythmic motion was, and still is, considered soothing for many infants. Lullabies, too, played their part, with traditional songs passed down through generations, their soft melodies and repetitive verses intended to lull a child into drowsiness. One mainstream historical fact is that Victorian child-rearing manuals often emphasize the importance of routine and regularity in establishing good sleep habits in children. A fixed bedtime, a quiet pre-sleep period, much like the advice given to adults. The idea was to train the child's body and mind to expect sleep at a certain time. Sensible enough on the face of it. However, when these gentler methods failed, or when a quick solution was desired, parents and nurses often turned to those infamous soothing syrups we touched upon earlier when discussing laudanum. A particularly unsettling quirky tidbit is the sheer number and variety of these patent medicines marketed specifically for calming babies and aiding their sleep, many containing opiates like morphine or codeine, as well as alcohol or even cannabis. Products with names like Godfrey's Cordial or Street's Infant's Quietness promised peace to exhausted parents and quiet to fractious infants. These were cheap, readily available, and tragically effective at sedating children, sometimes to the point of accidental overdose and death. It's a grim reminder of the lack of regulation and the desperation that could lead parents to use such dangerous substances. Historians still argue about the extent to which societal pressures, large families, limited childcare support, and the expectation of quiet, good babies contributed to the reliance on these chemical cautious. It wasn't necessarily that Victorian parents loved their children any less, but knowledge about child development and the dangers of these drugs was severely lacking, and the promise of a silent night was incredibly seductive. Beyond drugs, other soothers included items like sugar tits or sugar rags, a piece of cloth dipped in sugar water, or sometimes even wine or brandy given to a baby to suck on. While perhaps less immediately dangerous than opiates, it wasn't exactly a recipe for good dental health or a calm digestive system. So, while the ideal Victorian nursery might have been a haven of peaceful, sleeping cherubs, the reality for many involved a complex and sometimes perilous negotiation between gentle persuasion and the potent allure of the medicine bottle, all in pursuit of that blessed silence that meant the little ones were finally asleep. One hopes most relied on a good, old-fashioned, slightly off-key rendition of Rockabye Baby before resorting to the chemist's more questionable offerings. As we've journeyed through the dimly lit bedrooms and well-stocked apothecaries of the Victorian era, a recurring theme has undoubtedly emerged: the often unregulated and sometimes downright perilous nature of the substances people were willing to ingest or administer in their quest for sleep. While some remedies, like a cup of chamomile tea or a change of air, were benign, many others, particularly the patent medicines and potent chemical concoctions, carried significant risks. The dangers of self-medication in Victorian England were very real, fueled by a combination of factors: limited medical understanding, aggressive and often misleading advertising, a desire for quick fixes, and a distinct lack of governmental oversight. You might think twice before casually dosing yourself with something from a mysterious brown bottle if you truly understood what lurked within. The patent medicine industry was booming in the 19th century. These were prepackaged, branded remedies, often making extravagant claims for curing a multitude of ailments, including, of course, sleeplessness. One mainstream historical fact is that the ingredients of these patent medicines were frequently not disclosed, or if they were, the names could be misleading. Many contained high levels of alcohol, opiates, cocaine, or other potent substances, unbeknownst to the consumer. The advertising for these products was relentless and ingenious, appearing in newspapers, magazines, and on posters, often featuring glowing testimonials, some of which were likely fabricated and dramatic before and after scenarios. They preyed on people's anxieties and their desire for a simple solution to complex problems. Remember Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup? That was just one of many such products promising miraculous results with a secret, often dangerous formula. A quirky and rather alarming tidbit is the sheer audacity of some of these patent medicine names and claims. You might find remedies like Dr. William's pink pills for pale people, promising to cure everything from nervousness to, presumably, not being pink enough, or Warner's Safe Cure, which, despite its name, often contained ingredients that were anything but safe in large quantities. When it came to sleep, you might encounter syrups, elixirs, or balsams promising profound and refreshing slumber, with no mention of the laudanum or chloral hydrate that was actually doing the heavy lifting, and the potential long-term harm. Historians still argue about the precise moment when public and governmental awareness shifted significantly enough to demand better regulation of these products. It was a slow process, with investigative journalists, the muckrakers, and concerned medical professionals gradually exposing the dangers, eventually leading to landmark legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States, 1906, and similar reforms in Britain, though the wheels of change turned slowly. Before these protections, the consumer was very much at the mercy of the manufacturer. It was a true caveat emptor, let the buyer beware situation, especially when that buyer was desperate for a night's sleep and confronted with a dazzling array of attractively packaged promises. You could easily find yourself developing a dependence on your favorite nerve tonic, without ever realizing you were essentially self-administering a fairly hefty dose of narcotics or alcohol on a daily basis, all in the pursuit of a little peace and quiet at bedtime. It makes our modern anxieties about reading the side effects on an aspirin packet seem rather quaint in comparison, doesn't it? As the gaslights of the Victorian era began to flicker and fade, giving way to the brighter, harsher glare of the electric 20th century, so too did many of their curious cures for sleeplessness begin to recede into the realm of historical curiosity. The relentless march of scientific discovery, particularly in fields like chemistry, physiology, and the nascent science of psychology, started to shed new light on the complex mechanisms of sleep and the nature of sleep disorders. While the transition wasn't overnight, old habits and beliefs, as we know, die hard, the approaches to tackling a restless night began to slowly, but surely shift towards a more evidence-based and hopefully less perilous paradigm. You can imagine the old, laudanum-stained medicine bottles being gradually pushed to the back of the cabinet, replaced by newer, perhaps equally imperfect, but differently understood interventions. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the synthesis and introduction of new classes of sedative drugs, such as the barbiturates. Veronal barbital, introduced in the early 1900s, became one of the first commercially successful barbiturate hypnotics. One mainstream historical fact is that while these newer drugs were initially hailed as safer and more effective alternatives to older remedies like opium or chloral hydrate, they too, as we now know, came with their own significant set of problems, including a high potential for addiction, severe withdrawal symptoms, and the risk of accidental or intentional overdose. The quest for the perfect, side effect-free sleeping pill was, and in many ways still is, an ongoing saga. However, the very approach to drug development was becoming more systematic, with attempts to understand a drug's mechanism of action, even if that understanding was still rudimentary by today's standards. A quirky tidbit reflecting this transition is the gradual decline of the grand hydrotherapy establishments. While some spas continued to thrive, often rebranding as luxury retreats or centers for general wellness, the specific Victorian obsession with elaborate water cures as a primary medical intervention for serious ailments, including insomnia, began to wane as more targeted medical treatments became available. The wet sheet pack, thankfully, started to lose its appeal. Simultaneously, the emerging field of psychology, with pioneers like Sigmund Freud, though his theories on dreams are a whole other fascinating, if not entirely sleep-inducing topic, began to explore the role of the mind, anxieties, and unconscious processes in conditions like insomnia. This opened up pathways for non-pharmacological approaches, the early precursors to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, that is a frontline treatment today. Historians still argue about the exact tipping point when modern sleep medicine began to truly diverge from the more eclectic and often folkloric approaches of the Victorian era. It was an evolutionary process, not a revolution. The old beliefs about fresh air, diet, and a calm mind didn't disappear entirely, and indeed, many of those principles hold true, but they were increasingly supplemented and sometimes supplanted by a more scientific lens. The Victorian insomniac, who might have once chosen between a hot pillow, a dose of bromide, or a trip to the seaside, would slowly find their descendants presented with a different, though not necessarily simpler, array of options. And as we, too, prepare to drift off, leaving those Victorians to their restless nights and curious remedies, one can't help but feel a certain gratitude for modern mattresses, quieter streets, and, perhaps most importantly, a slightly better understanding of what it truly takes to get a good night's sleep, even if it still feels elusive at times. And so, our journey through the dimly lit corridors of Victorian nights, and their often peculiar attempts to find solace in slumber, draws to a gentle close. We've seen them reach for the potent allure of laudanum, bravely submit to the dousings of hydrotherapy, and meticulously adjust their diets and their bedchambers, all in pursuit of that elusive state of peaceful unconsciousness. The shadows in those Victorian rooms begin to lengthen and soften now, the gas lamps perhaps burning a little lower, the distant clatter of a carriage fading into a more profound quiet. The anxieties that kept them awake, the worries about health or finances, or the state of the world, begin to lose their sharp edges, much like our own worries tend to do when we finally allow ourselves to let go. The air grows still, carrying perhaps the faintest, lingering scent of chamomile or old books. There's a sense of settling, of the day's energies slowly, finally, dissipating into the quiet fabric of the night. You can almost feel the heavy velvet curtains doing their job, muffling the outside world, creating a small, safe haven for rest. And as these images gently fade, may your own transition into sleep be smooth and untroubled, far from the curious concoctions and earnest efforts of our Victorian friends. May your dreams be sweet, and your rest deep and truly restorative. Sweet dreams.